Today that are really very different. And actually, before I get started, I'd like to tell by a show of hands what you're a little bit more interested in, because there's two things very specifically that I'd like to cover. I'd like to cover the big picture stuff of what's going on now in this country in terms of tax policy. The two largest things is the new tax legislation that we just had, and the Deficit Commission report, which is going to be changing in very significant ways the way we live in the coming years to try to deal with this huge deficit that we have. In addition to that, the timing right now is very interesting because we are right at the beginning of tax time. And people are going to be starting to put together their information to file their tax returns for the 2010 tax year. So I'm sure there's a lot of people who are interested in, specific hints and items that deal specifically with their taxes. So, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. First, who would like to be, and I'm going to speak about both topics because I'm the speaker and I love both topics, and I'm going to talk at least a little bit about some. But I'm kind of curious to your interest. Who would like to see a concentration on the big picture, the policy and the longer term future direction? Just your hands. And who would like to do a little bit more in terms of specific ideas and specific tax return issues, that kind of thing? Okay, so more towards the tax policy it is. And thinking that might be a lot of the thought, you've got handouts. There were three items that were passed around. If you don't have them, you can ask about them. The first is a general policy thing that came out of a talk I had given to a group. It's a couple of pages, just general description of where the future it could be going. The second item is just a list of tax-saving ideas that I've put together over an extensive period of time. There's a number of ideas in there. Some of them are very specialized for people in specific circumstances, but I will tell you, and it doesn't have to be now, feel free at any time. My information is in there. If you have questions on some of them that affect you personally, feel free to just give me a call. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And the third item that was passed around is something that, although it was written 160 years ago in a foreign language, could be the Bible of what we're dealing with today. It's Frederick Bastiat's The Law. And I think I had enough copies to give one to everybody. I would actually think that many of you have already have a copy and have read a copy. But if you haven't, it's really must-reading, not only for you, but in particular for any younger people that you have. Anybody who's 7th or 8th grade or older can read it and probably understand it pretty well. It's extraordinarily well-written and very straightforward language. So I recommend it to everybody. If anybody thinks they know some people that could benefit by more copies, again, just let me know, and I'll be. I buy them by the hundreds to specifically so I can give them out to people who I think could benefit from reading. Having said that, let me just start a little bit with what's going on in terms of tax policy and the new legislation. We're now very much at a crossroads. We had a new administration a couple of years ago that came in. We thought it was going to be very liberal, and we didn't realize how liberal and how fiscally irresponsible it was going to be. We had a president and both houses of legislature, all from the same party, geared to do one thing and one thing only, and that was make government a bigger part of our lives. And they did a pretty damn good job of it from their perspective in their first 2 years. But lots of people, us included, didn't like it, and hopefully started turning things around this past election cycle. And I said hopefully started turning things around because in fact it's only the beginning. We've got a lot more to go. Not enough people have changed hands, especially locally, especially in New York. I'll talk about it a little bit later. Through some miracle, we have a governor, although his entire history looks like it would be continue the devastating effects of the state of New York. He's at least speaking a good game, and in the State of the State message, Governor Cuomo said things that were almost unbelievable. He almost sounded like Governor Christie, and people have been comparing what they've said. Let's just see if it can be carried through. And we need to hold his feet to the fire. We also have a Republican Senate in New York State, and that is critically important to hold things in balance. Let's see if we can do some things with New York State. In terms of the new tax legislation, it was a very interesting thing that happened. We had a lame duck session, which, even though it did not have the newly elected Republicans in it, nevertheless, because of the handwriting on the wall, they were able to put together new tax legislation that, for the most part, not totally, there was some give and take in order, basically, from my opinion, for the president to save a little bit of face and to make it look like he was taking a sharp right turn. But the tax legislation that was in there, the principal dollar amounts in the new tax legislation were all in the, were mostly in the right direction. We go back to the Bush tax cuts, and let's make no mistake about it. There were no tax cuts in this new legislation that was passed. There were no tax cuts. All it was a continuation of the law as it was. The three biggest dollar amounts in it were the tax cuts for the rank and file, the tax cuts for the wealthy, and the AMT patch. Those things were made up themselves more than half of the total cost of the entire budget bill, and they were very necessary not to cut taxes, but just to prevent them from increasing. So when people talk about the cost of the bill, it does, and you talk about $800 billion and $400 billion was tax cuts, they weren't cuts. They were just, there were increases that were built into the future budgets that now aren't there. So that's why they're calling them cuts. It allows us to keep taxes the same. There were some spending increases that we didn't like. I cannot believe this country is still giving ethanol credits. The sad part of it is it was passed as part of this legislation, even though everybody knows how ridiculous it is. You could say the good news is there was only $5 or $6 billion worth, but I remember when $1 billion used to be a lot of money.
Still is.
And so here's the issue. And by the way, one thing that I'd like to do during the course of this, if I'm happy to take questions as we go along. I'm going to try to keep it moving because there's a lot of things to cover. But I'm happy to entertain questions in the middle because I'll be covering a lot of topics.
Something, just because you said that it wasn't cuts, that I've never understood. If they've become cuts, they were the Bush tax cuts, was it that the taxes were so high before, or like why don't they just call it?
That's exactly correct. The Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, when Bush inherited, by the way, I'm going to start. You've heard about Obama screaming. He said, "It's not my fault. It's not my fault. I inherited this recession." And that's what they've been screaming. It's not my fault, and it's been a couple of years. People forget a critical factor that really galls me. When President Bush came into office at the beginning of 2001, Clinton had created, through his own policies in his final years, a recession that started in October of 2000, just before the election. So you talk about inheriting a recession. Bush inherited one of the sharpest recessions ever. And what did he do about it? He came into office, started with the 2001 tax cuts. It started improving the economy quickly, added more tax cuts in 2003, and turned the country around. And for the next 5 years, We had a very solid economy, some of the strongest growth ever. And those Bush tax cuts, which were cuts from the prior, basically the 40% rate went to 35%, the capital gains rate went from 20% to 15%, and the dividend rate, which is so important because that's where when corporations get taxed and then they pay dividends to people, the people get taxed again. So in order to accomplish, to avoid the pain of this double taxation, of which we're just about the only country in the world that does that, they reduced the rate of tax that individuals have to pay from 40%, which is what it was before, actually 39.6, from 40% down to 15%. That itself spurred tremendous growth. Companies were much happier to pay out dividends. People had more money to spend. It was a wonderful effect and a wonderful idea. And so those Bush tax cuts, which really were cuts from where the Clinton taxes were, went from, they started 2001, more cuts went in 2003. And solely because the Democrats refused to vote for it, so they couldn't get 60 votes in the Senate on those tax cuts. And I don't want to spend a lot of time describing it, but the basic principle is, in order to pass a law, generally, you've got to get by the filibuster in the Senate, which means you need 60 votes. You don't have 60 votes, you can't pass a law. But what would happen to a budget? We'd never have a budget if you needed 60 votes, because budgets are very contentious and you need to have them or else you can't run government. So only for budget purposes, you can get away with 50 votes in the Senate. You don't need the 60, but the laws don't become permanent. They only go for 10 years. That's why we have the problem we have now. The Democrats who had enough control in the Senate prevented the Bush tax cuts from becoming permanent law. They restricted them to 10 years. So it was the Democrats who created the situation that made these laws all sunset at the end of 2010. And so we were in danger now at the beginning of 2011 to reverse the Bush tax cuts and go to the law, the tax law, the way it was before the Bush cuts came into effect in 2001 and in 2003. In fact, it's interesting, the 2003 tax cuts were made to be coterminous, to end the same time as the 2001. They made it a 7-year instead of a 10-year, but everything was geared to end at the same time because everybody felt that Congress could then at some point just make these things permanent. But the Democrats never wanted to let them be permanent, and so that's why we ended up with the crisis we had now. And the Democrats were in full control of everything just before the tax legislation everything was deemed to end, and we were going to have a meltdown and go back to those higher rates. But as we said, in a lame duck session, just in the nick of time, we got this new legislation. So there's a lot of good stuff in the new legislation. Basically went back to the to what the Bush tax cuts were, but it's only for 2 years. It's only for 2 years. So there's a lot of work to be done on it. Yeah.
Incorporated in there, wasn't there a reduction in the Social Security? Wouldn't that be also a tax cut? Well, and Social Security being underfunded as it is, isn't that another problem?
Okay, let me talk about that for a second, because that's another big piece of this puzzle. A tax cut is when you reduce the marginal rate of taxes that people have to pay on their income. It is not a tax cut if Congress says, I want to give $100 to everybody who's on Social Security. Just remember it came from me, vote for me in the next election. Oh, but I don't want it to sound like spending. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make the Internal Revenue Service pay it, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell everybody on their tax return to subtract $100 off their taxes, or if they don't owe any taxes, just put a $100 credit in and we'll send you a check. That's not a tax cut. Spending that is spent